Hi everyone. I'm very happy to have with me today Johnny Farraj and Sami Abu Shmays. Hi guys.
Salam Fadil.
Hello. Great to be here.
Great to
We
be here.
have planned really this episode long time ago, but finally we are here.
Yeah, we've been looking forward to that. I think, we were talking before COVID, before the lockdown, that was about a year ago, and I'm glad now it's happening.
Yes. I'm very happy to have you guys, and I think without a further ado, let me start with the biography of each. So we start with who here? The eldest.
Tafadhal, Sami. Sami.
With Johnny. Johnny started the book project. So
Okay. Biography, let me talk about my musical biography. It's very simple. It's short. So I grew up in Beirut. Um, my family is Palestinian, but I grew up as a first generation Palestinian Lebanese. So I've a little bit of both cultures. I love both cultures. In Beirut, I was exposed to a lot of music, Arabic music on the radio, of course, all the time. And then when I was in my teens, I started buying cassettes. So I consumed a lot of Arabic music, Kulthum, Abdul Wahab, Warda. My formative period was the 70s, which had, of course, all the Arabized instruments already, the org, the guitar. That's part of my growing up. So I feel very natural around all these instruments, even though I can be critical, as I did in the book, about their ability to perform the Arabic maqam precisely. But to me, like they've been grandfathered in to Arabic music, and so there's no taking them out.
Mhm.
But my ambition was not to perform Arabic music. I actually was a pianist. I took some classical piano lessons. I gave up very quickly. I just could not connect to the music that they were teaching me to play. I hated it. Also, I was very bad at sight reading, so I hated sight reading. So the whole thing didn't like take off. But it gave me enough grounding to kind of feel comfortable enough with the piano. So I continued by ear. I continued on my own. So I started playing pop music, soft rock. Influences were like Elton John. Anybody who played the piano and sang, like Billy Joel. These people. And then my ambition was to play in a band for sure. My ambition was live performance, to be in a band. Uh, by by the time I got to college, I started a small band, or some friends and I started a band. It was called Out of Tune. And this
Mm.
Out of Tune band performed. The big challenge was to find the money to buy
oh,
instruments.
Nashaz?
Hmm?
Did you
Sorry,
call the band Nashaz like Brian's band?
I didn't call it Nashaz. I called it Out of Tune.
Oh, you
Like
called it out in English. Okay.
if you were in a Lebanese band, you had to call it an English name.
Right, right, right.
People in the US who want to form an Arabic band has to have an Arabic name.
Yeah.
Uh, but the challenge was to find a place to rehearse because not everybody had a house or a basement. So that was a big deal to find a spot to rehearse. The drummer, especially, that was very challenging. I think I had an organ. I had a synthesizer at the time. Also, if there was a piano, I played the piano. And we did a couple of little concerts. The war was really, really bad at the time, so we couldn't really develop a lot. I also played with the AUB Music Club, but that was actually a little bit better because we were on campus. They had a room full of equipment. They had a beautiful, beautiful Fender Rhodes electric piano.
Mhm.
I really feel like very kind of emotionally attached to that sound, the sound of the Fender Rhodes, very much.
Mhm.
It's also part of the progressive rock movement, so it was used heavily in that kind of genre. So I really like that instrument. I played it, for a year. I was with a music club. We did a couple of concerts. The last one was in '86. Interestingly enough, the concert had an Arabic ensemble and a Western rock pop ensemble. I played with the Western one. I would
Mhm.
never like have thought about playing in the Arabic ensemble. I looked at them as, like they were foreigners and we were like the normal thing to do. Very funny how life teaches you lessons. um, the interesting thing about the Arabic ensemble is they had an org, مشرق, Western, I mean Easternized, so it was Arabized. And the guy, this was '86, right? He showed me there was a bunch of buttons that were added on, so it wasn't constructed, it wasn't manufactured with quarter tones, but someone went and wired some electronic components with buttons
Mhm.
on the top of the keyboard, and you could press the buttons. There was a little LED, and then you could see that you can shift an entire range of notes down by a quarter tone back and forth. And he gave me a demo. It blew my mind. I was like, wow, this is incredible. So you
Mhm.
can actually do this on an organ. So this was my first experience of an organ, was in '86. They actually did something very interesting back then. They took a song by Cat Stevens, who he was dying to compose something with quarter tones, but stopped short of it because his instruments didn't allow him to. And they took it and they changed it into maqam Bayati. It wasn't like a nahawand, it was in minor.
Which
And
Cat Stevens song?
it was
You
called
remember?
Kipros. It went like this. It's an instrumental. It's not a song, sorry. And then they switched it to Bayati. So in the Bayati part, it was. And then and that blew my mind as well because I heard like Bayati playing on an org in a fusion style because the rest of the arrangement was, you know, Western, and was very, very interesting what we did in '86. And then the war got worse and I left the country. Long story short, I started collecting Arabic CDs. I was very interested in traditional Arabic CDs, also Iranian. I collected a lot of Iranian classical music CDs. I pursued my Western music, continued to play in bands. I was in Abu Dhabi for 2 years. I don't know, Fadel, if I mentioned that. I lived in Abu Dhabi from '86 to '88. We had a small band. We played definitely Western music. I played the keyboard. Somebody found a bassist. We had a drummer who was the singer. Actually, the bassist used to be also at the AUB Music Club, so I knew him from Beirut, and he basically introduced me to the band. I also sang in a choir. I had a really good bassy voice because I was working on it. It was beautiful to sing in a choir. I finally came to Rutgers to do my master's degree, and I also ended up singing in a choir in Rutgers. I did a lot of other things. I still had a synthesizer. I bought a drum set. I taught myself. I took some drum lessons. I can play like rudimentary drums, you know, but I have a good idea of how it works. And finally, I lived in London for a while. Didn't enjoy it much, and then came back to New York. As soon as I came back, shortly after, I met Sami through a friend of ours, Rania Renee. And then Sami introduced me to Simon Shaheen, introduced me to the Arabic music retreat, and the whole thing just mushroomed. It took on like a snowball effect. Because I think I had this pent-up desire to learn Arabic music, but I didn't know how to do it, and what I could do with it, what instrument. But one thing led to another, and all of a sudden the whole thing mushroomed. And I attended the Arabic music retreat 6 years in a row, from 2001 to 2006. They were very formative years for sure. I learned so much from people. Started listening heavily, and then that period overlaps with Sami. So I'll let him do his bio, and then we can basically continue the joint bio from that point, from the early 2000s.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, Sami.
Go ahead,
Sure.
Sami.
Okay. So my journey is almost in a way opposite Johnny's.
Right.
So I'm also Palestinian American. My father's Palestinian. My mother's white lady. I grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I did study classical music as a child, classical Western music, piano from 5 and violin from the age of 8. And I got interested in composition and music theory at a young age, but I had no exposure to Arabic music. Like a lot of, I think like a lot of second generation immigrants, my father really wanted to assimilate to American culture. So I didn't learn Arabic. He didn't teach us Arabic at home. So I grew up only speaking English. And it was when I actually started college in fall of '98. Yeah, it actually took me a few years. I would say it would be, sorry, I started college in '94, but it was in the fall of '97 that I kind of was introduced to Arabic music again. My parents had some records of like Farid al-Atrash, and they got rid of all those records when I was 10 years old, in 1986, coincidentally. I remember they got rid of all the old Arabic records, and we started collecting CDs because it was the CD era, and we just got classical CDs, and I sort of lost touch with Arabic music until '97. So I was actually introduced, I was in a class taught by Virginia Danielson, the author of the Kulthum book, and And she
Mhm.
invited Simone up to the class to demonstrate Takasim. And I had actually stopped playing the violin for a few years. I was exclusively by that point focused on composition and theory. I really never took performance very far. And Simone came and he played for us, and I felt a strong desire to reconnect with whatever it was that I didn't fully understand.
Mhm.
He reminded me of my uncles with his accent, and his playing was beautiful, and I hadn't really heard anything like it in a while. So I started studying with Simone in the fall of '98. Eventually moved to New York City in fall of '99 to start graduate studies at CUNY Graduate Center.
Mhm.
And I continued to study with Simone, I guess, between '98 and 2000. And then in 2001 is when I actually traveled to Egypt. So I was kind of studying with Simone for a few years and understanding a lot about the music, but understanding it intellectually and not really grasping it
Mhm.
in terms of, yeah, I had not yet learned to learn by ear.
Mhm.
So I was learning everything through notation. And as a Western trained musician, that meant that it was almost impossible for me to really sound Arabic or to get the intonation correct because
Mhm.
I was doing everything through notation.
Right.
Yeah.
So it was when I traveled to Egypt in fall of 2001, and I studied for a year with Alfred Gamil,
Mhm.
that I really began to learn how to learn by ear.
Mhm.
And that, I would say, was the really transformative moment for me as a musician.
Mhm.
Because I'd spent my whole life up to that point, I was a 25-year-old. I'd spent my whole life up to that point thinking about music in terms of notation and Western music theory, and starting to learn it by ear really changed how I understood, how I heard things,
Mhm.
and really developed me as a musician. So after spending a year with Alfred in Cairo, I then
Mhm.
spent a half year in fall of 2002 with 3 teachers in Aleppo in Syria.
Mhm.
Mohammed Qasas, who taught me Muashahat,
Mhm.
Abdul Minaim Senkari, and Abdul Lasat Bakar, who were 2 violin teachers that I had.
Uh-huh.
In
Yeah.
Aleppo, I was very socially isolated. Aleppo is a much more conservative place than Cairo is, socially speaking. So
Mhm.
I basically, I had like close to 13 hours of lessons a week, and that's all I did for about 4
Interesting.
or 5 months. And I would say, so I had a year and a half in Egypt and Syria, and that really was a very transformative time for me. And it's interesting because I left the States in September of 2001,
Mhm.
and I got back, although I had a week in summer 2002 at the Arabic Music Retreat. I actually didn't really return to the States until January 2003. So
Mm.
everything changed in the States during that time, because that was right after 2001. And
Yeah.
I totally changed in terms of my thinking about music. I returned to graduate studies at CUNY in 2003. And at that point, I found it very dissatisfying. I would say that was a major turning point for me, because I suddenly had a point of comparison. Spending a year and a half learning music orally from 4
Mhm.
different teachers, learning to memorize, learning what it is that I could learn purely by ear, and then coming back and seeing how music was talked about um, was kind of a shock to me. I was like, wow, these people
Mhm.
really don't understand anything about music. Like, the most uneducated, I had a realization, the most uneducated, quote unquote, uneducated musicians knew hundreds of times more about music than any professor. The whole
Mhm.
approach was one that, we can get into it later, but for me, that was a moment. And as
Mhm.
Johnny said, Johnny and I had been friends since 2000. And as when I returned in 2003, Johnny and I became part of an ensemble, Tarab ensemble, with another couple friends of ours, and a place in New York called Alwan for the Arts was opening for Arabic music, and Johnny and I were part of a scene of musicians who participated very frequently in the early 2000s. So Johnny and I had worked with Johnny, so in early 2001, 2002, I guess maybe 2003, 2004, the early versions of his website, I recorded some violin samples for him. So Johnny and I became very close right as soon as I got back in 2003. We were close before, but we really, after I came back, we were working together very closely, both as musical collaborators in other groups, and then having a lot of conversations about Maqam.
I also visited you in Aleppo.
Yeah, and Johnny visited me in Aleppo in summer of 2003. That's right.
Very, very interesting.
I introduced him to my teacher. So we had started to, I would say, Johnny and I had started to develop a similar philosophy and aesthetic and rapport about the music. Interestingly enough, coming from two different places, right? I came from a Western background, no exposure to Arabic music, Western training, and then realizing that I wanted to do Arabic. And then Johnny also rejected Arabic music, went to the Western side, and then wanted to come back to it.
Interesting.
So we kind of met somewhere in the middle there and found that we had a very similar philosophical approach to realizing that the music was the guide, and that theory and things that people had written about it were not necessarily to be taken seriously. So Johnny and I both felt like we needed to really understand the music on its own terms, based on how we're performing it, based on what we hear in it. And I would say that enabled us to work together. I'll go on a little bit and then I'll pass it back to Johnny. So just very briefly. So then in 2005, I started my group Zikrayat in New York City.
Yeah.
Which included Johnny and a number of other musicians. We did classic music from Egypt and the Arab world, and music for belly dancers. We focused a lot on this period of Egyptian film music, especially a very rich period where you had both classical music, more dance music. That was 2005, started that group. I started working on my concepts for Maqam, and I created my first version of my Maqam lessons website in 2006, 2007. And I was starting to think about my ideas of how Maqam was different, right? So we worked with Johnny, and we had a very solid, by that point, Johnny's website, Maqam World, had become the internet resource, for the traditional definition of Maqam. It was very complete. But I was starting to think about how I felt that Maqam was different. So when Johnny started his book in 2008, he started without me, and I'll let you talk about that. But this was also a time period where I was starting to think about different, so I had already came up with a few different ejnas that I thought were not defined in the traditional theory. And I was starting to introduce them to Johnny at that point. So I was like, no, what are you talking about? This is all nonsense.
Interesting.
So it took me this time period. So between 2008 and 2013, I ended up publishing a paper in Music Theory Spectrum, where I first started presenting these ideas. I actually finished the paper in 2011. So I was writing it between 2008 and 2011, but academic publishing takes a while. So the paper came out in 2013, at which point I did a major overhaul of my Maqam lessons website and added a whole section, an analytical section that was meant to go along with that paper. That's called Maqam Analysis of Prime.
Yeah.
So it was in 2013 when I had that published, and then I finished the overhaul of the website, that Johnny invited me to be a consultant for his project at first. So let me pass it back to Johnny. Sure. To pick up some ground there. So that's sort of like me up to the point of where Johnny invited me to join this project.
I like the way you guys are so connected by time, by location, by the understanding. and believe about music. Go ahead.
If you see us have one of those book discussions together, you wouldn't think that. You would think that we're like mortal enemies who are fighting till the death, because every point in that book was debated back and forth until one of us had to really convince the other of their opinion. So it wasn't like, this book didn't come easy. So I think, Sami corrected a lot of my notions. I corrected a lot of his notions. We both basically, he had to sell me every single point that he published in the book, every single sentence, every single new gens suggestion, etc. And I had to, sell him the same.
Yeah, I think the point there is that I was coming up with new ideas for Maqam.
Right.
And Johnny had a goal of writing something that was very accessible.
Right.
And at first, Johnny thought that my new ideas would make it more challenging for people.
Right.
So I had to convince Johnny through a process that took several years that actually the way that I was talking about Maqam, the way that I was thinking about Maqam was actually going to make it easier for people.
Right.
Because it was more in line. So introducing these new ajnas, which seemed like it could be a complication, it seemed like it could be right. So we had to go have this back and forth process where I was like, no, this is the correct way of doing it. And Johnny's like, well, it has to be accessible. You have to like, right? So I had to teach him, I had to convince him, he had to show me how to make it accessible,
We should talk in detail about our approach to writing, to co-authoring.
Yeah.
But before that, I wanna rewind a little bit and talk about Maqam World and why it came about. And
yeah.
So I want to give credit to the community that I was part of. This isn't something I invented. I took the initiative. I did the coding. It was very simple, HTML at the time. But I can't take the credit for the content of the website. The content basically came from the oral tradition that we were part of, and I'm very grateful to everybody who was around me, who taught me some stuff about al-maqamat, al-iqa'at, and everything that's in there. Is not my own material. This isn't my material. I'm responsible for actually publishing it. But we were part of a very rich community at the time. In the early 2000s, there was some kind of a critical mass of Arab American artists and academics in New York City. I don't know about other states, but I hear it's been the same. There was a very, very strong critical mass, especially after 9/11. Also, that critical mass became bigger because more people were interested. More people basically, it woke them from their sleep, from their cultural sleep, and they gave them a kick that, oh, what is this Arab heritage that I have, and what does it mean? And so there were a lot of performers. There was also comedians. There were actors. There were poets. There were spoken word poets. There was everything. It was all happening. Alwan was the space that we used for most of our gigs. Of course, it wasn't exclusive, but it just so happened that it was so convenient that we always hung out at Alwan. We did concerts. After the concerts, there was the after concert scene where everybody would just hang out. We would have somebody would cook dinner, and then we would end up playing music until late hours. And this is where I just organically absorbed the repertoire. I absorbed the theory. I absorbed the style. I absorbed the lingo, the language spoken by musicians. I was a complete beginner when I came to New York in 1998 as an Arabic musician. I knew some basics of music. I had been a modest performing musician. Like I wasn't really like a career musician. My degree, my first degree is electrical engineering, and my second degree is in computer engineering. So I can't claim that I've studied music or music theory or music performance or composition or anything like that. I'm purely an engineer, but I get it. After the period of immersion. So again, like we had this whole circle of friends that like to play, and a lot of it happened not during the concert. A lot of the learning and exchange of information happened in rehearsals. The rehearsals were like a family gathering substitute, basically, because I'm an expat. Sami in New York also, he kind of lived, even though he's American, he lived like an expat as far as the Arab community was concerned. So whenever we had a rehearsal, it was like having your cousins over. It was a beautiful social occasion. It basically fulfilled our musical needs.
Yeah, I want to jump in there.
Needs, our cooking, we cooked a lot. We used to cook all the time for rehearsals.
I want to jump in on this because I think what Johnny is talking about now is really important. the social scene, and this is, I think, a theme that you'll see reflected in the book.
Mhm.
We try to make very clear the fact that a cultural tradition, in this case, we're talking about Arabic music,
Right.
can't really be separated from the social scene.
Mhm.
Not only in an abstract way, but in a very concrete way, in the sense that the way people learn has something to do with the social environment they're in,
Totally.
Mhm.
and the way that they learn has an effect on the music that they play. So when you learn Arabic music in an environment where there's a lot of informal instruction, you
Mhm.
learn in a particular way that's different than if you're learning exclusively through formal instruction, through being taught in a class by a teacher, right?
Sure.
So, for me, I had a lot of teaching that was formal, especially in Aleppo, but also in Cairo. But
Mhm.
I also at those times had a lot of informal learning, in the sense that when I was in Cairo, I would watch Alfred's jam sessions. He had a group Qithara with a bunch of very talented young singers at the academy, and he would bring them over to his apartment to rehearse. And I would be there, and I would watch the rehearsal. I would watch the jam. Maybe they would ask me to take my violin out. I'm still a baby musician, so I didn't really necessarily contribute very much as a jammer at that time. But we were sort of joking before we started this, before we hit record on this interview, about tea, and how part of my apprenticeship with Alfred was learning to make tea in exactly the way that he made it.
Mhm.
So I could make it for him while he's in the middle of rehearsal, right?
Yeah.
So everything sort of fits together. It's not like I'm making tea just to arbitrarily be his servant, right?
It's a
It's
ritual.
I'm making tea in the context of, we have tea when we're together, right? العيش والملح. We share tea, we share food, we share music. And that environment that Johnny's talking about, right? So when I got back to New York City, I consider myself very lucky, as Johnny is expressing, like, I'm really happy to hear you saying this, Johnny. Like,
Oh,
we were lucky to have a critical mass, as you put it, of friends who did this, and we got to eat together, we got to play music together. And it's actually, I learned so much more from the informal aspects of learning
right.
than from the formal ones, because you pick up, oh, this person did that in their taqsim,
Mhm.
and you
I mean,
feel it.
I
It's
know
different than a lesson.
you're having trouble separating jam sessions from rehearsals, and you're interchanging them. It's because, let me explain why. It's because rehearsals are effectively jam sessions, because we don't rehearse only the pieces that we're going to play, and if we do, after the rehearsal we'll end up playing other things. So we rarely, like, usually rehearsals were just a pretext to get together, rehearse for a couple of hours, do a prova, and then we can just relax and drink some tea or other stuff, and then play music, for. And part of that rehearsal was lots and lots of taqasim. Another part was listening. We did a lot of listening sessions. I remember at the beginning, wow, it was amazing. We would discover, one person we discovered in the early 2000s was Hassan al-Haffar, who's a munshid from Aleppo.
Yeah.
He blew our minds. He was incredible, incredible. So we would play a qasida by Hassan al-Haffar, like من مثلكم لرسول الله ينتسب مثلا, or يا جيرة الشعب اليماني. And
Mhm.
that qasida would be over 10 minutes, and we would follow his ajnas modulations one by one, pause it, and name the jins, and then play again, and let him do his modulation, pause it again, and was like, oh my God, is that Sika Baladi? He just did Sika Baladi. Everybody was like, oh my God, he did Sika Baladi. And then everybody would be satisfied that Hassan al-Haffar gave us what we expected of him, because he did Sika Baladi on the octave of Maqam Ras Matalan, which is expected if you're a professional. But you wouldn't know all these things.
Hassan al-Haffar is one of the only examples I have of Maqam Bayatain.
Bayatain, mazboot.
Okay.
No, he's incredible. So we had listening sessions. We did a lot of analysis, a lot of exchanging of knowledge. And from that oral learning process came Maqam World. Now, why is this so important? Because when we went to write a book, and we did a book proposal to a very prestigious publishing house in the Western world. The peer reviewer in charge had a very big critique of the book, which is it was not based on other books. And so we had to argue the point that why should it be based on other books if we learned our stuff? We didn't learn it from other books. And then the other critique was that, well, we consulted some books because we were trying to document how sayr, the concept of sayr for a maqam, how is it explained and stated in Arabic music theory books. I went through like 10 music theory books and I documented how sayr is explained. The critique came from the peer reviewer that why are you only consulting Arabic books? Imagine how I felt, like, you know, this is our tradition. I consulted books from my tradition. We learned it all without your help. Thank you very much. And you want me to consult books in English? Like, this body of knowledge belongs to us and we can very well learn it in Arabic. And we don't even need Arabic books to learn it. We can learn it orally. But if you insist, we're going to learn it from Arabic books. So why would you complain that we haven't learned it from English books, which we didn't? And the whole book was written without really much recourse to books. And so I had to argue that, you know, the ultimate Arabic music theorist probably never read a single English book in his life. So why would you require us to do that? And that was a very sticking point with the publisher and with the reviewer. And the justification we got was that, well, you're publishing a book in English in the English publishing, academic publishing tradition. If you want to publish a book in that tradition, you have to use the methodology sanctioned by that tradition, which is requiring reading of previous references, and anything that was stated that you agree with, that you're stating again. If it was stated in a previous book, you have to give credit to the previous book where it was stated. We went retroactively and read like a dozen English references between papers, book chapters, entire books, etc. And then inserted citations after the fact in our book to make it academically worthy. And then the reviewer was satisfied that, yes, now this conforms to the Western tradition of publishing, which is you have to get your knowledge from other books, or you have to state if this knowledge basically was mentioned in previous books and give credit. So we did that. And that made our book academically worthy. But I always want to make it clear that this is not how we learned our tradition. We did not need to have recourse to English books or most of the Arabic books out there to learn our tradition. And most of the musicians we perform with in New York City, like the people we consider virtuosos, haven't learned it from English books or mostly Arabic books.
I want to jump in on this point also, because I think Johnny is highlighting another theme of the book and of the book project.
Right.
One of the rewarding things about the book project for me is the way that it's kind of trying to be in both worlds on a few different dimensions. And the one that Johnny is pointing to is this idea of being an academic reference versus being an accessible introductory book. Johnny's original concept, which he didn't talk about yet, was to write an Arabic music for dummies in the Dummies series, right?
That was the early idea, because I met a person who wrote a book for the dummies. He was
right.
Arabic.
So the idea, so we have on the one extreme like an introductory book for dummies, and the other extreme, the idea of something that would be acceptable by an academic publisher. I mean, we were published by Oxford University Press. So the question of how to do this, how to satisfy both audiences, was a major issue that Johnny and I had to grapple with. And I would say in parallel with that is this idea of the oral versus the written tradition. So we are trying, in a way, it's an interesting challenge. I think we accomplished it. But I think the long-term effect of it is one that we still have yet to see. But challenge is we're trying to elevate oral tradition within a context that values written tradition. And in order to do that, we still have to satisfy the written tradition's demands, right? As Johnny described. We still have to satisfy the need for it to be academically viable and reference the right things. But from our point of view, what we were talking about before, our understanding is that the music really develops from the community. Our knowledge of the music came from our existence within the community. And we're trying to elevate that community and the oral tradition within the book. So how do you do that and satisfy academia? I mean, again, really interesting challenge to do. Go on, Johnny.
Not just elevate the oral tradition to the level of a written tradition, also elevate the Arabic classical tradition to the level of the Western European classical tradition. This is definitely a very clear goal of the book, is that, you know, I don't see why the Western European classical tradition should be an exception in its adoption and its quality and its reputation, as opposed to other musical traditions, which are also classical and equally complex or more complex in some dimensions. Like the book is trying to show that, yes, the Western classical music is complex in some ways. It's extremely complex and beautiful in some ways, nothing wrong with that, but you're not the only tradition that's extremely complex and beautiful in some ways. Like Arabic music can be incredibly more complex in its rhythm, treatment of rhythm, and we're not even the most complex. You know, you go further to Iran, it gets more complex. You go to India, you go to the Arab Gulf, it gets more complex. You go to Morocco, it gets more complex. This is like, we're even modest in our treatment of rhythm, but we're already 100 times more complex than Western European music. Which cannot imagine odd rhythms to start with, or things in 17 and in 15 and in 11. The other dimension in which we're very, very complex is our treatment of intonation. The precision of our intonation is phenomenal, and they cannot even imagine what it is unless they listen to our music for years and acquire this new ear training that is necessary, like it's a prerequisite for. So definitely the goal of the book was to do that and put our classical music and hopefully neighboring classical music, Turkish, Iranian, the same argument could apply to all of them on the same level of Western classical music in terms of its importance, its complexity, its richness, all that stuff. So we want to unseat Western European classical music as the most highly acclaimed worldwide. Even like it's very sad that even in the Arab world now it's highly acclaimed and it's considered like a high tradition versus our tradition being a low tradition. That's all an effect of colonialism, and you know, we can get into that. This is like, there's a very strong decolonizing goal of the book. But what I wanted to say is, part of the book project is I applied for a grant. I applied for a grant from AFAQ, which is the Arab Fund for Arts and Culture. Their office is in Lebanon, but they supply artists in the entire Arab world. I applied for a grant for someone to help me write the book, for people to do my research and fact checking and review and music editing and stuff like that. So the proposal for my grant was that was the foundation of the proposal. It's to highlight the importance and complexity of Arabic music, and by that basically we achieve a political goal as well, hopefully, if the book is successful, which is, you know, humanizing the Arab world and showing its complexity through its music. And I know that this works a lot in other traditions for other countries, and it's like a very well-known process or approach for getting political equality in the United States. And so that was the basis of the proposal, and the proposal was immediately approved. I heard from the person on the grants committee that that project stood alone in that year of all the grants that were applied for in that year as the most important project in its cultural mission for the Arab world, even though I wasn't producing something in Arabic, and I wasn't producing something that was going to be sold and distributed or consumed in the Arab world, like a piece of music or a film or anything like that. They actually agreed with me that the goal of doing this in English, publishing this in the English world, would be like a really important goal. Based on that, I got the grant. And using the grant money, I hired two people. I hired Sami, and I hired another person, Dr. Samir Ali, who's Syrian. He did my fact-checking research and all the Arabic side of the fact-checking, which required reading Arabic sources and all that, because Sami couldn't do that. And
Uh-huh.
so that was kind of one of our goals. The other goal is to own our narrative and have a book about Arabic music written by an Arab person or an Arab practitioner, because both of these things are lacking. Arabs writing about Arabic music and practitioners writing about Arabic music are lacking. So we definitely fill the gap in that sector as well.
Interesting. Actually, I really like the discussion, so I left it to go that way. It's so interesting that I didn't want to interfere actually in the discussion, and it went very well. But I want to go back to the first point. Let's actually highlight the first and second generation culture and music. You guys are two examples: first generation and second generation immigrants.
Yeah.
I think this is worth a discussion here.
Yes, I mean, you're right that we are different in that way. I grew up listening to Arabic music, and not just Arabic music, religious music, which is maqam based. Yani, the neighborhood where I grew up in Beirut was very multicultural, multi-ethnic, and multi-religious.
Mm,
My family itself is Greek Orthodox, so I got the Byzantine tradition from going to
mm,
church. And the Byzantine tradition is a modal tradition. It's almost like the next door to the Turkish tradition, or some say that a lot of the Turkish tradition is based on Byzantine, etc. So that
mm,
was definitely one of the neighboring traditions. And then the Islamic tradition, outside my window in my bedroom in Beirut, there's a mosque, and I heard the mosque 5 times a day. And plus, they had lots of other events that they held sometimes during Ramadan, where they had lots of chanting, and so I got that too. And
mm,
adhan is still, until today, is still one of my favorite sources of listening to a maqam and really like taking the modal journey with a maqam, because it's just voice. It's one
mhm,
of the purest forms of delivery of maqam for me. And it's also one of the oldest established. In other words, like the melodies we're listening to were all passed on orally. So we know for
mm,
sure that what we're listening to is stuff they were singing hundreds of years ago, probably with the same exact intonation, maybe a tiny change, but it hasn't gone through a process of recording, westernization, new instruments, nothing like that. It's a lot
mm,
purer than even the music we listen to that is recorded in Egypt in the 70s, for example, in terms of its adherence to the traditional intonation and pitch of the maqam tradition. So these were my influences. I came with all this, but I had the gap in my Western music knowledge, which is fair enough, because I didn't study Western music and I didn't know the terminology, the pedagogy, the approach. So I couldn't have written a book that would be accepted by Western music departments on my
mm,
own. That's why I got the grant and I hired Sami initially. And then I realized that, like, we discussed it. The content he was providing was more of a co-author than of a music consultant. So he became the co-author, and then we're both happy with that change.
mhm.
Do you want to?
Interesting. Sammy.
Yeah. So in terms of the second generation aspect, I would say, so I've had a lot of identity crisis. And I think that some of that identity crisis was productive in terms of helping me learn how to teach. So my father's Muslim, my mother's Christian. I'm Palestinian and I'm American. When I lived in Egypt, um, I had never realized how American I was until I spent a year in Egypt. And then I came back from the Middle East to New York, and Johnny said I was like living like an expat, right? It's like I didn't feel like an American when I was back in New York.
Mhm,
And my first training was in Western music, music theory, and I had to unlearn all of my musical training in order to learn how to learn by ear.
mhm,
So as a teacher, I found that I learned a lot about my own difficulties in learning Arabic music. Has really helped me to teach, because I came in with this, a lot of students in the US are students who have studied Western music and become interested in Arabic music and then want to learn something about it.
mhm,
They come in and they know how to read music, or they have some Arabic piece that someone else notated for them and they've learned to play it through notation. And I have to undo for them the same thing that's been undone for me, which is this process whereby you don't think about music until you see it written on the page. But also, I think the identity crisis for me gave me a window into being able to be critical of theory on both sides. So I found that both the Western approach to describing Arabic music was overly narrow and rigid and was based on theoretical assumptions, and that the Arab music theory was undeveloped and was basically accepting some of the assumptions thrown on them by the West. Some of this has to do with intonation. And I want to get back to something we were talking about before with intonation, because I think that the issue of intonation has always been one that is such a challenge for people to grapple with, and it can be a focal point for everything that happened in the book. So I want to put a few themes forward and let Johnny pick up those threads.
Sure.
But let me see. Yeah. Are you done?
So in terms of intonation, there's this assumption that there are such a thing as quarter tones, meaning that there are notes that are exactly halfway between notes on the piano keyboard. We even call them E half flat, as opposed to the note that's halfway between E flat and E natural. And that assumption that the basis of the tuning system is the piano keyboard is a Western assumption. And it's not based in the musical reality of the Arab world, but it's one that's been accepted by the Arab world since the 19th century. Colonialism started in the 19th century. So you have 2 centuries of Arabs looking at their own music from a colonial approach, and Westerners, it's like this regurgitation. It's like what Edward Said described in Orientalism. There's just a regurgitation of the same false assumptions about music. The West says it. Arabs who feel insecure about their own culture accept the Western description of them. Westerners who don't know about the Arab world accept the Arabs' description of themselves that's based on the Western description. So there's this vicious circle of regurgitated falsehood. I came in and I was able to see through both of it because of my identity crisis. And because I had a training in Western music, and then I had that experience of being a fully trained in music theory at the graduate level in music theory, and then understanding that my graduate level training in music theory was total nonsense. Was total nonsense in terms of being able to learn by ear and then being forced to learn it. So on the issue of intonation, the thing that I realized, that Johnny realized, that a number of our friends realized, and that a number of people have spoken about, is that intonation is variable, and Arab musicians will tell you this, but they don't have a framework for it, right? They say, well, it's variable, you just do it like this, right? So you have these 2 approaches. The musicians will say, well, you play it like this. I don't know why, but you play it like this. Oh, it should be a little lower, it should be a little higher. Okay, so musicians are able to articulate very precisely, oh, that's too high, that's too low. But they then have this feeling like, well, we don't know why it's that way, or, well, it's probably 5 commas up, or it's a quarter tone here, or it's a little bit wrong, but people do it wrong. And I want to highlight that idea of like, well, we don't know what it is and it's wrong. And I want to make a comparison here with what happened to American blues and jazz music. Because the same thing happened with colonialism, which is you have these notes that are part of African American music that are not in the Western equal tempered scale, that people said, well, these musicians are uneducated, they're playing it wrong. So we need to correct it. These quote unquote blue notes are not really part of the scale. There's slides. You hear descriptions of non-Western music saying, well, people are sliding to notes. And Johnny and I read there's a famous book by Daniel Levitin, This Is Your Brain on Music, where he talks about
I have to find that book.
There's only really 12 notes, only really 12 tones, and all the rest of the scales of music in the world, they're just like variations on. So there's all these assumptions. You have this Western assumption that everything is, there's a mathematical system that determines musical intonation, whether that system is some form of equal temperament, meaning equal divisions of the octave, or some harmonic system based on the ideas of Pythagoras, just intonation, that everything is mathematically correct through integer ratios of harmonic frequencies. This may be over the head of some people. But anyway, so on the one hand, mathematical justifications for intonation. And on the other hand, musicians are saying, well, it's a little off, right? So you have these two camps of the way that music is being looked at from intonation. And those who are in the mathematical camp say, those who are in the musicians camp, they don't know what they're talking about. They're uneducated. They don't understand music. And those in the musicians camp think, well, what we're doing is wrong, but it feels right. There's no theoretical justification for it, but we're doing it. And so this dichotomy, I highlighted that it exists in American music, it exists in Arabic music, it exists in music from all over the world. And what we did in our book, and what we're trying to do in our sort of philosophical approach, is to provide a justification for why the musicians are right. And why there is not the kind of mathematical explanation that music theorists think exists for intonation. So we're trying to say, no, those musicians are right. And we make this very important analogy, and I'll maybe let Johnny pick up the thread there, which is, no, intonation is not determined by mathematical laws. It's determined by cultural factors. It's determined by it, and it moves in the same way that vowel sounds in a spoken language move. It varies, it changes over time, it changes over geography. These are observations that we made, but we're just saying that these observations are truth rather than evidence of something being corrupt or it went off or it went wrong. No, it's actually the difference between an Egyptian E half flat and a Syrian E half flat isn't wrong. It's actually an important feature of the music, because then you can distinguish Egyptian rust from Syrian rust, and they're different. That's a feature, not a bug, right? Whereas at the Cairo conference, when they tried to find one E half flat, they're trying to get rid of their flattening, just like the Americans flattening the blue notes. It's a form of racism. It's a form of colonialism. But for us, even before the racism and the colonialism, it is simply disregarding actual knowledge that musicians have and treating it as lower. And we're trying to say that knowledge is higher.
Sami, it's like observing nature and putting a model like in physics to understand how would we predict or how does it work. It's a very tiny model, let's say, that we are trying to stretch to describe all sorts of cultures of music into a model.
But this isn't a big problem for musicians. It's a bigger problem for academics, because they're producing material that doesn't reflect really what's happening in performance.
But Johnny, wait, it is a problem for musicians because it influences pedagogy and it forces people to be taught in the wrong way.
I was going to say that if you're trying to learn by reading books about it, then it's a problem. If you learn orally from Abdul Basit Bakar or Muhammad Qassas, it's not such a big problem, because you're getting the correct repertoire and intonation, ornamentation, all that stuff orally, and you wouldn't know that it's being written about in such a distorted way. It's a problem if you're looking for books, if you live in New York and you don't have a teacher and you're looking for books, and the book tells you, it's a quarter tone or it's a tetrachord or all those concepts that are not Arabic, then it's a problem. And this is like why this book, one of the goals was this book was to provide musicians with something that they could use to learn about their own tradition written by other musicians. So it's the book is like a substitute for the oral gatherings that we have. This is really like the premise of the book. So it talks about things that we've experienced. It doesn't talk about things that other people wrote. So we like, when I write about like tarab or the taqsim or all that stuff. I'm writing from a musician's perspective, from the perspective I gained by mixing with other musicians. And so there's no contradiction. So we didn't allow the influence of a written material or theories or anything like that to actually, well, we did in the beginning, but we cleaned it up. We didn't allow it to corrupt the content of the book. And in the end, the book reflects 100% what you would learn if you were sitting with a group of musicians.
I'd like to pause here, if you allow me, Johnny and Sami. Actually, I will go deep into this point here, but I would like to just hit into the concept of a model or a theory
Yeah.
that's brought up from the practice. I'm sure you have compared, for example, the theory of Turkish music or Azari or Persian music to the practice. Did you see it come close to the practice from your experience compared to your
I
work?
haven't looked at them in
Yeah.
detail, but I hear they have the same problems with the gap between theory and practice that we have in the Arab world, Persian and Turkish. I think they have
Yeah,
the same.
Mm.
Yeah, we've heard that some musicians are taking a similar approach. I think you mentioned some to us in a previous conversation.
Yeah.
I'm sorry,
Yeah,
I have
yeah.
to look at it. And
Mm.
other people have mentioned it. So I think that it's something that I'm optimistic and hopeful that musicians from other Maqam traditions, as well as musicians from other world music traditions, are
Mm.
starting to own their own narratives again. I hope that what Johnny and I have done is actually part of a movement among musicians to
Mm.
reclaim oral tradition, because definitely the kind of thing that we have done could be done in any music tradition. There are elements that are there in the music that are just not adequately described by music theory.
Yeah, I'd like to focus on the book shortly, but do you want to highlight how this community in New York has came up and how big? What do you guys do and that gathering for how long? Just I want to get an insight about it. Then we move to the book.
The community, in terms of the number of musicians, for example,
Yeah, I mean the number of musicians who goes to that
So
community.
let me go back a little bit. Let me jump in a little bit about the community.
Yeah. Mm,
So New York has had a thriving belly dance scene since at
mm,
least the 1950s.
mhm,
sure.
And in the 1960s and 70s, especially, you had all of these belly dance clubs and musicians, not only Arab, but Arab, Greek, Armenian, Turkish, Israeli, all of these musicians performing together for belly dancers.
mhm,
And you also at the same time had an Arab American music scene of people who are actually producing records of Arab music in the States. And some of that was based in New York City,
mhm,
with Rashid Sales and Rashid's, the father, I guess, Albert Rashid, who was actually had his own record company.
mhm.
So New York was a very rich, fertile place when we came. So the generation that we're familiar with is like Simone Shaheen came to New York in the 1980s.
Yusuf
And
Kassab.
he studied with Yusuf Kassab at that point. Yusuf Kassab, who was a young singer at that point in the 70s.
Mhm.
Michel Merhej and Hina Merhej. Michel
And
Merhej.
Michel Merhej from who played with Feiruz and who just passed away recently.
Yeah.
So these musicians were here and they were playing for the Arab American audiences and for belly dance audiences.
Mhm,
And Simone took a very particular approach where he wanted to, starting in the 90s especially, he wanted to elevate Arabic music to be a classical tradition. So he wanted to take it out of the belly dance scene. So there's this split that starts to happen in the late 90s where it's like classical Arabic music on the one hand, belly dance music on the other. But we're lucky, I think, in New York City as opposed to other places in the country. We're lucky in the sense that both scenes thrived and kept surviving until really 2001. So with the tragedy of 9/11, a lot of the belly dance clubs closed in New York City, especially the Arab ones, and you have this greater tragedy of live music in New York City, where the livelihood of musicians started to decline from the 70s and 80s and 90s, especially into the 2000s, because of recordings for whatever reason, live and combination of real estate prices, etc. So we're the part of that Johnny and I are a part of is the post 9/11 revival. So you have this decline, and then Simone starts his retreat in 98, and there starts to be a critical mass on the East Coast of people who have gone to the Arabic music retreat in the early 2000s. Some of the leftovers and holdovers for people, for the older musicians who used to perform in the clubs that got shut down. Some of the older Armenian and Greek musicians who were there.
Right.
So you have a number of generations interacting in the early 2000s of some decline on the one hand and some increase on the other hand, as Simone is gathering more people on the Arabic music retreat. And then Alwan, which Johnny and I both talked about earlier, became a new hub for the Arabic music scene for about 15 years. I would say from the early 2000s till maybe 2012 to 2015. Alwan started to fall out of the way the last 5 or 6 years.
It's not just Alwan. The whole critical mass started falling.
Yeah, but we started, a new scene started with some friends of ours called Brooklyn Maqam Hang. Started in 2018 and started to pick up where, I mean, it's interesting because Arab music, I would say, as of a year ago, before COVID, in New York City was one where the Arab musicians were, some of them are playing in the, in the Greek clubs and playing for belly dancers. Some of them are working with other world musicians or with jazz musicians. It's sort of like Arab musicians are integrated into the music scene in a way. It's like there is an Arabic music scene, but not all the Arab musicians are necessarily always there. But there's enough musicians that there's enough to do. There's enough musically that you can have a rich experience, but not, I would say, like a little bit of what Johnny and I got to experience in the early 2000s with people really being able to jam all the time. We don't get as much of that. Maybe it's because we're both older and have kids, but anyway. Johnny, you want to talk about that? About the scene?
I mean, the scene in the 2000s was very rich because it was people who didn't just want to make music for a living and go home. They actually were genuinely interested in learning and in developing and becoming better musicians and in teaching. So there was this critical mass of people who were feeding off on each other, and a lot of them were had a nerdy direction in their approach. So they really wanted to learn and classify things and learn details and names. And so a lot of them came from other traditions as well. Like, there was a point where Amir Safar came from a jazz tradition, and he basically became part of our circle. And we started the cross teaching. Like, we started learning Iraqi maqam from him, and he started learning the Middle East and the Sharqi tradition from us, and vice versa. People who had done degrees in jazz music or who studied at Berklee College of Music, who had degrees in Western style music theory, etc., like Tariq Aboushi, even Dimitri Michalis, who's Greek. They brought in their knowledge of jazz and of fusion, of innovation, and there were people who were like firmly grounded in the tradition. Like Yusuf Kassab, Zafar Tawil, and George Ziadeh, to name a few, but there was many other people. But, everybody interacted and gave and took, and we all learned from each other. So this is the kind of the environment where we all learned. We're really lucky that it existed. That the critical mass started fading. I don't know why. Maybe because the public started fading. I don't know which drives the other. I think sometimes the public drives the market. Sometimes the performers drive the market. I don't really know enough to kind of analyze why. I think it's a little bit weaker now, but before COVID, there was definitely a revival, as Sami said, and there was a new location. I think the location really is what did it. Having a space that is a constant space that has history behind it. I think that encourages a lot the performance. You go to that space and you know that people have been playing there for years and years, and it has this history behind it and memories and its own audience that's, like anytime you put together a concert, you went to Alwan and they programmed you on the program, and then you were guaranteed that their audience would be interested in you and vice versa. So the whole thing flowed very effortlessly.
I would like to ask one more question about the community and then move forward.
Yeah.
Actually, what has protected or maybe saved you from like a noisy kind of music if you have everybody coming into that place from all cultures? And is it the name like Arabic music? Because you have all of these guys, all of these guys, coming from different educations, traditional, formal, informal, jazzy, whatever,
Alwan,
academic.
are you talking about New York City?
Yeah, 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 yeah.
No, Alwan had a very clear angle in its programming. They had a very clear agenda. Their programming was music, arts of the Arab world and neighboring countries. So they had a little bit of Persian, a little bit of Armenian, a little bit of Turkish, but mostly Arab. It was an Arab arts center. So their programming was always that. So they were definitely selective. Because their mission and their funding and all that was based on programming Arab arts.
Okay.
So it wasn't like a general. It wasn't like a venue. Like there's a million venues in New York City that have different various traditions, but Alwan was devoted to the Arabic tradition. I remembered something, Sami. Can I go back to a previous point that you said about the identity crisis? Can I pick up on that point for 2 minutes? I think it's very interesting.
Yeah, sure.
You assume that people who grew up from Arab parents in America have an identity crisis, which is correct. I hear this from many friends. You assume people who grew up in the Middle East don't have an identity crisis.
I didn't say that.
No, okay, maybe the listeners assume that, but it's not true actually. Unfortunately, like I have to say this, like frankly, growing up in Lebanon, Lebanon itself as a concept has an identity crisis, whether it's Arab or not Arab, or how Arab it is it, and it's a constant negotiation. The influence of Western culture on Lebanon is immense. You feel like Western culture is entering the Arab world from Lebanon. Like this is like the point, the wedge where Western culture enters the Arab world. We're like right on the tip of that wedge. And so you grew up in Lebanon, like the point you said about why Arab music theorists, even from the 1930s onward, why they took on Western classical pedagogy without really questioning. They took it on because it was very, very, very strongly, pushed on them by the wedge of colonialism and westernization and globalization, whatever you want to call it. It's basically colonialism. That wedge is very strong. And growing up in Lebanon, it's very easy to lose sight of your tradition because, look at the school system. You don't study your tradition as much as you study foreign traditions in your school system. Even up to my university years at the American University of Beirut, we had cultural studies that we studied the Greek texts and Latin texts and English texts and then Western classical music. There was no course in Arabic music. There was a course in Western classical music. So like you could argue that engineers don't need to study about music, fair enough. But if they do need to study about music, why study about, German composers? Why can't we study about local composers or Egyptian composers? It was, in my opinion, it's atrocious and it's doing so much injustice to the local culture. But this is a foreign institution, and that's their agenda. Their agenda is not to privilege our culture and to teach us the beauty and the richness and the complexity of our culture. It's basically to sell their culture. And so as a product of that system, you grow up feeling like, okay, you kind of take it on board and you don't question it too much. But then once you leave Lebanon, you realize that, oh, wow, this is like, there's this big contradiction now in my, when I left Lebanon and came here, initially, I wasn't really like particularly proud of Arabic music because I didn't think it was worthy enough, or I heard it was my native tradition. I wasn't particularly proud of Arabic language either for the same reason. We weren't particularly proud of our culture because our culture was under attack, it was downplayed, etc. So you can call this an identity. It's not exactly an identity crisis. It's a crisis of confidence, in our culture. So to me, like the book project and getting back into Arabic music, performing Arabic music, playing at weddings even. Like I really love playing at weddings because I want to play this music at weddings by Arabs. It was a way of reclaiming the culture. It was a way of reclaiming, my pride in this music and showing that there's reason for pride. This music is super complex. And let me show you how it's complex and beautiful. So to me, like I kind of came full circle by coming here and doing this project, just like you kind of came full circle into, accepting this. So it was a very therapeutic process for me. It was a labor of love, and I'm much happier. I'm much better off because of it.
Mhm.
I appreciate that you picked up on this theme of identity crisis. And I think as you say that, I think people have acknowledged this before, but I think it's worth acknowledging in this context that in a way, colonialism creates an identity crisis for everybody. So
Mhm.
as soon as you have one culture that is dominant over another, politically, militarily, whatever, economically, you have this feeling, and so much of what we describe in the 20th century, from Egypt even, reflects this identity crisis.
Sure.
In other words, one of the things that we talk about in the book is how much Western instruments are you going to include in your music? How much Eastern, right? And there's a sense in which there's a feeling like, well, we have to Westernize because Western is superior, but then we still like these Arab elements. And as I listen to the history of Egyptian music, which I love so much, I was recently teaching a Maqam class. I was teaching on Maqam Nahawand, and I used one example, Sahirtu,
Mhm.
Abdul Wahab's famous tango from 1935.
Yeah.
And Abdul Wahab is a great example of almost a productive use of identity crisis.
Mhm.
Sahirtu is a masterpiece.
It's a masterpiece, yes.
It is an absolute masterpiece. It's a masterpiece even if you take out the tango.
No, but
Composition.
more so because of the tango. It's
More so because of the tango, but it's like it has multiple layers of masterpiece in it. And it's like he's using this Western element and he's making it so Arab, and he's using the bandoneon and the instruments with the most Arab maqam. Johnny mentioned Sika Melody before.
Right.
And Abdul Wahab is he's doing it in this very sophisticated, because there's a film clip with it where he's like in the bow tie and he comes up from the stage. We watched this, you can find it on YouTube. Like he comes up from the stage and you see him like appearing on stage like Michael Jackson in the 80s. Like he comes up from below the stage and then he sings the song and has the full orchestra, and like everyone in 1935, they show the audience in 1935 in Egypt trying to look as Western as possible.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that the identity crisis of which culture is superior or inferior, or can we see them as not superior or inferior, but because we see them as equals, this challenge is something that takes 4 or 5 generations, right? We're trying to undo formal colonialism in Egypt. Ended in what, 1952, 1956, but colonialism is still at play in the Arab world,
but
the United States, right? So there's still this feeling of and then people in the United States are like, well, I'm interested in, right? People in the US in the dominant culture are interested in world cultures. People in other world cultures are interested in the US. And I would say for us, I think we did a good job in the book project of embracing both sides of the identity crisis, right? One of the things that we get compliments on of the book is that even though we're critical of the way that Western instruments distorted Arabic intonation, we still embrace the Arabization of Western instruments. So like no other book has a chapter on Arabized instruments. That was Johnny's, like, I have to include in there this chapter about the way instruments were Arabized, and we embraced it.
We didn't embrace, we didn't condone it. We didn't condone it. We wrote about it. We didn't condone it.
Well, by writing about it, we embrace it.
Embrace is a very, it's not up to me to embrace it. They embraced it already. It's in the Farq al-Masiyya. Al-Farq al-Masiyya cannot exist without the organ and the guitar. It's not up to me to embrace it. It's up to me to talk about it or not talk about it. I chose obviously to talk about it, because not talking about it would be not covering the subject fully or correctly. It would be like a essentialization of Arabic music. It would be like a double exercise in purifying Arabic music and rewriting history. What happened is they did embrace it, and when they embraced it, I'm writing about it as a matter of fact, that there's a chapter called Arabized Instruments because Ahmed Adawiya, who's the most sounding Egyptian Shabi singer, you can't get more Shabi than Adawiya, uses a trumpet. Like who am I to like deny the trumpet after Ahmed Adawiya uses Sami al-Babli on the trumpet? Like it's not my choice. But my
Yeah,
choice was to write about it or not, and I did. Of course, I'm gonna write about it. And also, the second reason I'm gonna write about it is that it's my generation. I grew up in the 70s and 80s. The trumpet, the saxophone, and in Kulthum, the guitar, the org, they were part of my existence. So I wrote about them. As a matter of fact, I could not imagine like a book on Arabic music that essentializes Arabic music and doesn't write about these things. It'll be really lacking. But going back to Abdul Wahab and how they dealt with colonial influence and westernization, all that. It's very interesting that you talked about it. So there's this book called السبعة الكبار في الموسيقى العربية by Victor Sahab. And to me, like I read this book, the whole message of this book is that colonialization was entering the Arab world with such force that they had to actually deal with it. They had to acknowledge it and give the audience some westernization in their music. They could not continue like Zakaria Ahmed. Zakaria Ahmed is one of the old guys who didn't westernize, and he basically stopped composing for most people in the 50s, and kind of that's it. It was the end of his era, for example. But others like Sayyid Darwish, all the ones listed in that book, Sayyid Darwish, Abdul Wahab, Qasabji, Sumbati, why those are mentioned in the book? Because all of them tried to bring in Western elements. Sayyid Darwish was the first, he brought opera elements. His adwar, al-ahat and his adwar have opera elements. Qasabji, of course, he had some harmony in his songs. Abdul Wahab, of course, they brought in Western rhythms like Latin American rhythms, the accordion, the piano, etc. But at the end of the day, I think they won the battle because they negotiated. Okay, we're going to bring in those instruments. We're not afraid of these instruments. You want a Western flavor, we'll give you a tango or a rumba or whatever, like مثلا قفنه علم الغزل. I can't remember the rhythm in that, but it's some Latin American rhythm, and the castanets and whatever instruments they used. Sorry, I'm not an expert, but at the end of the day, they won the battle because like Abdul Wahab, he is clearly showing at the end of Sahirtu, you think I'm bowing to westernization and I'm kind of I've lost the game. Here's Sika Baladi. I'm gonna bring you squarely back into the Arabic realm, and I'm still in control, and I'm still a composer, and I'm still like the Beethoven of the Arab world, and we're Arab, and this is Arabic music. This affirmation in Sahirtu of bringing back Sika Baladi at the end is like nothing has changed. I can bring in tango, accordions, flamenco dancers, whatever you want. It doesn't mean anything. It's still Arabic, 100%. And Abdul Wahab was the last of his generation that was able to win the battle, because I argue, like in my humble opinion, that what happened after the 70s is everybody just fell down and gave up and started composing with harmony.
Guys,
and the synthesizer was the king, and khalas, we lost the battle. After the 70s, we lost the battle.
Johnny,
So was the last.
I think this point of discussion worth another episode to debate about many things. Okay. And actually, I would like to come back to how the book connects to the community. Where actually, when I saw the book is available, by the way, it's called Inside Arabic Music. It's available on Kindle, and it's printed. It's there in Sami's hand, in Johnny's hand. Yeah. So it's a very beautiful book. Actually, it came out after previous contributions you guys did, and we mentioned Maqam lessons, the Qira'at, and the podcast, Sami. A lot of good articles. I really enjoyed them at the time, and really worth seeing. I think they are still available online, right?
Yeah, I have some of the articles available on the Maqam Lessons website.
Yes. So now this book, when you see any book about Arabic music or whatever music, it's always focusing in one aspect of it. Let's say, for example, maqams, right? Or maybe a book about usuls or iqa or rhythm. But this book is reflecting the whole thing that you guys discussed in the community.
There's a reason for that.
Yeah, I mean, would like to go into the content now and then go in detail about these things so people can enjoy and appreciate and maybe reach out. Actually, I have seen discussions about the tones, the rhythm, the culture, tarab, taqsim,
Yeah.
talking
Notation.
about, jins, okay, and
Musical
then talking
instruments,
about
telling me about musical instruments, musical
musical
forms.
instruments, Western or Arabized instruments, all of these things, and you guys have appreciated a lot about, music from the 30s, I think, on, from the
Yeah.
1930s on, in a
Yeah, I
certain
would say
area in the
we're
map.
we're narrow in our area of study. In other words, we're really focused on that golden age,
Hmm.
especially Egyptian and Syrian music,
Hmm.
mid 20th century. So we narrowed our focus there, but then within that focus, it's covering every aspect of the music.
Yeah, so maybe it's good to go over the content. Let's browse through the content and
Sure.
see
Sure.
what we have covered in the book.
I can browse. I can give you the
Yeah, please
architecture.
walk us through the contents, Johnny.
So originally, so when I started the book idea, I wanted the content to be broad. I wanted the book to be horizontal because I
Hmm.
wanted an introductory book that was not too deep in its content and its level of difficulty, that could cover every question in a potential musician's mind. So this was really a book written by a musician to a musician. This is all I learned. I'm going to put it in a book, and the next
But
generation
also for an introductory textbook,
Hmm.
introductory textbook for you mean
for people who are, we wanted to replace Tuma's book basically in academia
we
as the
wanted
introductory textbook.
Right. We wanted to rewrite Tuma's book because Tuma's book has many good points, but also it's lacking in many ways because it focused
Hmm.
more on folk. It was too theoretical. We wanted something written by a musician, and I maintained throughout the lifetime of the manuscript that the language must be really, really simple. The style must be simple. Even the length of the sections, the length of the sentences. I had all of these requirements for style that will would keep the book at the level that I wanted it to, not to overwhelm people. And so that was one of the areas where we had a lot of going back and forth because Sami wrote his sections and I had to argue to readapt them into the style of the book because you can't have sections that are very deep and kind of the language was too academic or too advanced. And then the rest of the book, because then people would skip these chapters, and or it would make the book undesirable for some people. So my focus was on how to keep it horizontal and cover all of these subjects. Sami's focus was how can I explain the maqam in all its depth and go deeper into maqam and sayr and jins and the whole philosophy of sayr and why is the maqam what it is, and which is great. It's amazing. So we combined a horizontal idea with a vertical idea in the
Yeah.
middle together in one book, and basically brought my sections a bit more complex and his section a bit more approachable and with the style and all that. It took us years to rework
Hmm.
Yeah, I mean, our writing
that
process together
content.
was
And
was
so
between 2013 and 2018. I would say that was like
Hmm.
from my first look
while
to where we really felt like we had a complete final manuscript was 5 years.
so we have the introduction, and then we have a section on instruments divided into melodic instruments, Arabized instruments, and percussion instruments.
Hmm.
That's, I think, is a must for any introductory book. You can't have a book without the instruments. And then we talk about ensembles, how to put all of these instruments together.
So I want to say
Ornamentation.
something about the ensembles chapter as I look at the contents of the ensemble. So again, here you see that we're embracing not only the traditional ensembles like the takht, but we're talking about the Arabic orchestra as it evolved, the belly dance orchestra, Arabic pop ensembles, the use of hybrid ensembles like we talked about with Sahirtu, right?
Yeah.
We talk about this in the book. How is it that you put together an ensemble that's going to play an Arabic tango? Well, you have to have a hybrid ensemble.
Not
Hmm.
just for an Arabic tango. You take a piece by مثلا Farid Al-Atrash in the 70s, like Habina. There's a bunch of pieces all from the same movie. I think it's Nagham fi Hayati. I can't remember. His arrangement is very hybrid. He has an electric buzo, a guitar, like Habina starts on the guitar, right? This is a hybrid ensemble. It has the guitar, it has the org, it has the electric buzo, and that has all the other instruments. And to me, like, it's undisputably Arabic, right? You can't argue that Habina that arrangement is not Arabic. It's Arabic. So we got to write about it. There's no way I'm going to exclude this kind of arrangement. It's a beautiful song, just like the songs in the 30s, right? So to me, like that whole diversity of ensembles and arrangements from the 30s to the 70s, they're all equal in their importance. So we're going to talk about all of them, right?
Yeah, I would say, just to say one last word on that. So this is chapter 4, we're talking about ensembles.
Yeah.
One of the most interesting things to happen in Arabic music, and it ties to the themes that we talked about before about Westernization, is that there's such a diversity of ensemble design, and there's an evolution of ensemble design over the course of the 20th century. So we really had, it was a lot of interesting, fun thinking and writing to talk about this evolution and diversity of ensembles in this chapter. So like anyone who reads this book is going to see, we really treated the full range of ensemble diversity.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Okay, and then so we talk about ornamentation because it's a natural spin-off from instruments. And ornamentation, I think, is a chapter I'm very proud of, because I don't think anybody like wrote a chapter on ornamentation before. The whole philosophy, what is ornamentation? How do you learn it? Why is it not notated? What does it consist of? And why is it different for different instruments? And why can you not notate it? Why can't you notate it? It would be pointless. All of these philosophical discussions about ornamentation, and basically what is the result of ornamentation. We talk about heterophony, which is it's a fact of life, heterophony, but I don't think Arabic musicians have a word for heterophony, because to them this is like normal. It's the normal course of playing in an Arabic ensemble. Nobody says, "Oh, we're doing heterophony," because it's not a thing. It's how our ensembles sound when we have multiple ornamentation on multiple instruments. It's just like the English-speaking theorists called it heterophony, and now it's a phenomenon like in Western music pedagogy. But to us, heterophony is how we have a conversation. You have a bunch of people over for dinner. Everybody chimes in they talk over each other. This is heterophony. We have it in music. We have it in our culture. It's a normal thing. So we don't have a word for heterophony in Arabic, but I talk about it because I want to explain why. And then rhythm, of course, rhythm. So that's a chapter that goes deeply into the theory of rhythms, the dums and the taks, and how to structure an iqa'. What is an iqa'? This is a completely lacking concept in the Western music theory world. There's no iqa', a rhythmic cycle that repeats itself, that gets ornamented over. It's ornamented differently on different instruments. It's a huge angle of the richness of Arabic music that doesn't exist in Western classical music. This is one of the areas where we're far superior. They don't have the vocabulary to describe what we're doing. Okay, and then sample iqa'at, بعدين song forms. Okay, so that was a very important part of the performance. Describing the song forms, why are there so many different song forms, the instrumental forms and arrangement coming from that. This is kind of the end of the performance section, the first half of the book. And then the second half starts with tuning systems. So I'll let Sami talk about that.
Sure. So again, we start then talking about, we wanted to go from the very basics of understanding the melody of music. So from chapter 11 through the end of the book is kind of an in-depth treatment of maqam. And we started by essentially in chapter 11 talking about critiquing the Western assumptions about how tuning is set up. So I consider probably one of the most important things that I've ever written in my life to be the section called The Arbitrariness of the Scale, where I make an explicit reference to the idea of arbitrariness, and I've made a little play on words, the arbitrariness of the sign, which comes from linguistics. The idea that things are not determined by some natural law, but there are cultural choices behind every element of culture. Someone chooses this sound versus that sound, and there's a choice involved.
They're also not determined by convention, by the outcome of a meeting.
So do you have choice, and then convention is when a community adopts that choice, and then people follow what happens in the community. So we're making explicit the idea that music evolves in its elements, in its melodic elements, in the same way that language evolves, that there are arbitrary choices made, that a community adopts those arbitrary conventions. Those conventions then become what you have to do, so they don't feel arbitrary to practitioners. This is a philosophical problem that Saussure dealt with, that is understood within the linguistics community, but is not widely understood outside of it. And this concept of arbitrariness is, I think, the most important and most difficult thing for musicians to understand. Everything in music is arbitrary. That doesn't mean that there's not such a thing as a physical harmonic relationship. I think this is probably the most important point on the theoretical level that I've made, is just because one string vibrates in a ratio of 3 to 2 and you have a harmony where the frequencies vibrate in a way that's like, that's physical reality, right? If you have one string vibrating at 330 cycles a second and one at 220 cycles a second, and they overlap, physical reality, right? So then people will say, okay, and this is since the time of Pythagoras, therefore music is determined by that mathematical ratio. And the answer is no, absolutely not. Just because that ratio is there doesn't mean you have to use it for music. And it is a choice when you do use it. Right. So highlighting choice as the basis for the tuning system starts chapter 11. And we then talk about several of the different areas. So you have this long history of tuning fourths and fifths, just intonation and Pythagorean intonation. That is the basis of the oud tuning that became the basis of Arabic music theory for a few thousand years. And then you have these arbitrary elements that vary, like the vowel sounds in language, that vary over geography and culture. And the tuning system is a hybrid. And again, it is a convention that was adopted by arbitrary choices that became the convention. So that's how we approach the tuning system. And then from there, we talk in chapter 12 about notation and all of the challenges we face about how do you notate, why do you notate, when do you notate, what is the effect of notating on learning, what are the problems with notating, what are the advantages. We really treat notation from a 360-degree point of view, rather than just saying this is how you notate.
Do you think we treated it fairly at the end? Do you think we gave the pros and cons fairly? Because I don't know. I wrote that chapter. My attitude to notation is definitely.
And we both wrote that chapter. I mean, some of the chapters, I would say, Johnny and I both wrote all of the chapters. He was the primary contributor to the first ones. I was the primary contributor to the later ones, but we both wrote major sections in every chapter.
But my slant was definitely negative because I survived all this time without notation. And you could argue I'm just the Rick player, but no, right now today I'm learning the oud and I'm a melodic player. But also the Rick player needs to know the music as well as everybody else in the band. Otherwise, you can't do your job. So I know dozens and dozens of Shumays by heart, and dozens of Mashahat by heart, and dozens of songs by heart. So I remember more than melodic musicians, even though I don't play a melodic instrument. But I try to give it its justice. But definitely my attitude is that it was a detriment, more so than it was a benefit to Arabic music. And I'm not shy about saying like the final conclusion of the chapter. But you know, this chapter can be critiqued by someone who can give us.
It's an opinion, you know. I mean, I think the thing that your viewers should be aware of is Johnny and I took this approach with the material as not being afraid of our opinions. Not making a false attempt to be objective. We're trying to present everything we know and everything we think about it. So, I mean, it is, certainly the chapter on notation has a point of view. Not everyone will agree with it. So then the next few chapters get into the heart of this discussion about jins. And jins is, right, jins comes from the Arabic word genus, and the concept of jins was adopted by Arabs who looked at ancient Greek tetrachord theory. So there's this heritage of 2,000 years of history of jins, but we essentially try to make the concept of jins be more in line with the actual practice of music. And that, I would say, was the first major innovation of maqam theory that's presented here, which is we talk about jins not only in its interval context, meaning the size and shape of how it sounds and the melodies, but also we allow the melodic aspect of jins to drive it to the point where we start to recognize that there are ajnas that are not defined in the traditional theory because their intervals might be the same, but their melodic behavior is different. And so the examples that, that I gave, the sort of the most typical example of my innovation here is the jins that I originally called secondary rust, but which Johnny persuaded me to call upper rust in the book, which is this fact that, okay, you have these same intervals between rust and upper rust, but melodically one leans down and has a very strong tonic emphasis down, and the other one has a strong tonic emphasis up, and their melodies are different. So to say this is the same jins just because it has the same first intervals is wrong. So this is how we're critiquing the traditional theory, is we're saying, yes, you can describe intervals, but if you don't take into account melodic direction within the jins, you're not fully capturing. So we took that, we redefined jins in chapter 13, and then 14, 15, and 16 is basically a catalog of all of the ajnas used in Arabic music, both the traditional ones and the new ones that I identified and that I worked with Johnny. Right, I had to persuade Johnny that all of these were real. We then had to find examples in the repertory, right? So everything that we do, so from chapters 14 through 16 and then chapters 24, whenever we're concretely defining something about maqam, we set a standard for ourselves that no matter how rare, we have to find at least 2 examples of a particular maqam melody or modulation for it to be considered part of the system.
Otherwise, it's okay.
I mean, this was our standard because essentially we're saying, if we're describing cultural conventions, we're describing things that are repeated by people. So we have to find something that people repeated. So everything we do here, every one of the new ajnas we came up with are things that exist in the repertory, that multiple people do, that we found multiple examples of, and then we defined it on the basis of that. So after those ajnas chapters, we get into this discussion of maqam, and I don't want to take too much more time just summarizing the content of these chapters, because at a certain point, I would say the strength of the maqam chapter is that we look at, dissect the metaphors that people use, and we point out the fact that scale is already a metaphor. The idea that notes are arranged in some order of steps, maqam, right, is a word meaning position or place, right? That's a metaphor. So by understanding that the way we talk about music, high pitch versus low pitch, are metaphors, we then are able to then go back and look at maqam and see how is the melody actually behaving and create new metaphors. We talked about subway maps, the tree metaphor that people use trees and branches, the root jins, the trunk, and then the branch maqamat. And then we came up with my metaphor of choice is the network metaphor. And understanding that the ajnas move to each other in a sort of a multiple different kinds of pathways. I think this is another innovation. People talk about traditional theory and they say, okay, if you're doing maqam rust, you're going to start in jins rust, and then you're going to go to jins nahawan, then jins hijaz, then jins bayati, then jins upper rust, and then come back down, right? Presented as a linear story.
Yes.
Whereas in fact, you have these branching possibilities that go in and circle back and have a network. You can see the network just by doing a graph.
Yes.
So that's an innovation there. And Johnny, I would say, did more of the writing in the modulation chapter, which is the next one. Especially Johnny was, this is one of the strengths, I would say, that in order to make things accessible in the book, Johnny likes to talk about things in a metaphorical way. So the bus trip is Johnny's metaphor for a maqam journey. The meal,
The cuisine.
the multiple, the appetizers leading to the main course and the dessert is another metaphor that I think we use for sayr, I think somewhere, or modulation.
For the wasla.
For the wasla, right? So the metaphors are great, and so Johnny started introducing metaphors to help people understand the journey that we're talking about that maqam is. And then as soon as Johnny started introducing metaphors, I was like, oh, we really need to take this even farther. So then I started introducing more metaphors, and we start critiquing the metaphors and unpacking the metaphors to understand that the metaphor isn't maqam, but it can help us understand maqam.
Yes.
And we look at it from both sides. We look at it from inside the metaphor and from outside the metaphor. So then, we basically summarize these concepts from modulation to sayr, which we, as Johnny mentioned earlier in this interview, right? He looked at a bunch of books, how they talk about sayr, how they talk about the pathway, the melodic pathway. And then we provided a richer way of just talking about it based on our view of the music. We then talk about improvisation. So we talked about, in the first half of the book, the composed forms.
Yes.
And in this part of the book, we talked about the improvised forms. And the reason that we saved the improvised forms for later in the book, chapters 21 and 22, is we can't talk about improvised forms before you talk about maqam.
And modulation, and sayr.
And sayr and modulation, because really, improvisation is just an articulation of the maqam. It's an articulation of the sayr of maqam. So we wanted to talk about the maqam and our concept of maqam, which then makes the concept of improvisation richer once people understand our concept of maqam. So we get into that in those chapters. We talk about tarjama, the way instruments and singers interact in improvising. And this tarjama, right, is its own metaphor for how the music works, for how the community interacts. In other words, that there is this cultural phenomenon of you have a melodic pathway that is a choice. That choice becomes a convention, and other people translate that convention, and they work together, and there's this community that reinforces itself, and that's how communication happens. So tarjama became a metaphor for actually how the community and the music grow together.
And the listeners.
And the listeners grow together. And then that goes into the metaphor with tarab. It's like this idea of tarab is not a phenomenon that a single person experiences by themselves. It is the experience that everyone has together when you have master musicians and listeners who are familiar with the tradition and musicians playing with each other, right? So we develop those ideas, and then finally, we do what you have to do, which is what everyone asks for. Can you give us all the maqamat, right? Everyone wants, this book has to have, we called it the maqam index, but you have to have a listing. So what we did is we listed 35 maqamat, but our rule for listing them in this book was, as I described earlier, these were not maqamat that exist in theory books. These are maqamat that we have demonstrated repertory, both from Egypt and from Syria, and from Lebanon and other parts of the Arab world, but we had to have repertory. So every single one of these maqamat that are presented lists musical examples where you can go hear them, where you can hear a song using them. And I would say one of the most important parts of our book is that we list, like, we have 300 musical examples for our points.
I think,
and that is as important as the text that we write, is that we say, okay, right, I'm just open to a random page. Okay, right?
Yes.
This is chapter, this is Maqam Hijazkar. Okay?
Yeah.
And look, examples in Maqam Hijazkar include the following. The fourth verse of Muhammad Abdul Wahab's instrumental, right? We're talking about instrumental pieces, vocal pieces, jihad from Syria, things from Egypt. We have a graph, we have a scale. We're showing the maqam, but those examples are what we want people to go and listen to. And I would say, and I'll talk about it there, is this is where my YouTube series takes off from the book. Because in a way, we are explicit in the book that the book is a guide but it's the actual experience of being in the oral tradition of learning music by ear that is what people are going to learn with. So the book is like, it's like a tribute to oral tradition, but in and of itself, it's not oral tradition. So we're always pointing outside the book. You have to listen to this. You have to.
It's like a travel guide. You buy a travel guide.
You have to actually go there.
About Paris. You can't learn about Paris from reading the
Exactly.
travel guide.
I like that metaphor. Johnny's always coming up with great analogies.
Well, once you go to Paris, the travel guide is going to be your guide. You're going to look at
it's a guide, but you have to go and listen to all the examples. And so then what I started to do on YouTube is I started to create video lessons for every jins and every maqam in the book that are you know, because then you can hear the examples, you can hear the melodic phrases that are used in improvisation tied to each one. So I'm partway through that process, but in a way, what I would say, and I'll let Johnny pick that up, the book is like the cornerstone of multiple projects that Johnny and I have to educate people about maqam, right? We each have our websites, the Maqam World website that Johnny is the beginner of this process, which not only lists the scales, but also has tons of musical examples, right? So some of the musical examples listed in the book,
the main
you go to the website and find them. Yeah. You have my website and then my YouTube series. And we're kind of, in a way, we're trying to put these all together. They're mutually reinforcing forms of pedagogy. The book is only one piece in the way that we're trying to educate people.
But first and foremost, people have to listen. You know, the key is going to listen. I want to say something about the Tarab chapter, which is another kind of complaint I have about Western pedagogy and the limitations or the problems with that. Tarab is one of those concepts that's highly orientalized, and it's mystified. It's mystified in books. They talk about Tarab as if it's something that only happens in the East with its complexity, the orientalization of the East. Tarab is like
haunting. You have to use the word haunting.
You have to use the word haunting.
Curious and haunting.
It's a metaphysical state, and they try to explain it. Like the thing that gets me is people who try to explain Tarab in English have never felt Tarab. They have no idea what Tarab is. You know, it's like Tarab is as common as you know, eating a sandwich of falafel and thinking, this is really good. Tarab is very, 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 very common and very, very ordinary and very widespread. Everybody feels it. Some people are more connoisseurs of the music. They understand the details. They understand the maqamat. They feel it at a more detailed and kind of deeper level. But everybody feels Tarab. The cab driver in Cairo or in Aleppo plays Kulthum on their car radio, and they're listening. They're like an ecstasy from this. So to come and explain Tarab, you know, the words they used to translate it, ecstasy and enchantment, and they are so lacking and so limited and so orientalizing. You know, it really just, you know, kind of, I felt like we have to write a chapter about Tarab just to kind of put it out there. Okay, guys, stop it. This is Tarab. Let me just explain what it is, right? It's musical enjoyment for people who actually are familiar with the music. And in a melodic tradition, like, you know, Tarab changes, even though like we're saying Tarab is Arabic, it changes between listening to Muwashahat and between listening to, I don't know, some kind of a folk music by Fairuz. It's a slightly different form of Tarab. If you go and listen to Gulf music, it's a slightly different form. If you go to the Iraqi maqam, their Tarab is very different. It starts feeling more Iranian. You know, if you go to Iran, their Tarab starts getting more vertical than kind of horizontal. They go deeper and deeper and deeper. They modulate less. Do you notice that? Whereas in our music, we modulate more, but we don't go too deep. We don't dwell on the same scale for half an hour. Like if you go all the way to India, that's the other extreme. They take one raga and they dwell and dwell and dwell and dig deeper until the raga is like etched in your brain. Each regional tradition is slightly different, and there's nothing metaphysical about it.
There's and time also, time-wise, on the timeline, like the area, the time, which decade and so on, right?
Of course.
It maybe changes. Community, yes.
And the Tarab in the old days, in the 30s, you could listen to a wasla for half an hour and stay in the same maqam. Our attention span today is shorter, you know, you can do 10 minutes and then you're ready to move on. It's kind of like everything else in life, you know, it's become commoditized. But anyway, I just wanted to write about Tarab from the perspective of someone who actually feels tarab on a daily basis,
Yeah.
not for someone who researched it in books and read about it, and Derlanger wrote and Farmer wrote and I don't know who wrote about tarab, and it's this like secret phenomenon that happens in the East. Like the whole purpose of this book is to demystify Arabic music,
Yeah.
and I hope that we've achieved this goal, because it really like bothers me the way it's kind of treated in the Western world. And demystification creates a boundary, it creates a barrier of like, we can never really deeply understand it. Well, you can, but you're not doing what you need to do to understand it, which is listen to the music. You're not going to understand it by reading about it. You're not going to understand it by reading sheet music about it, certainly. You're going to understand it by performing it with other people who perform it, by learning it, by listening to it, by living it. You have to live it.
Yeah.
Once you live it, tarab becomes demystified. You won't have to read about tarab. Then you will actually experience tarab, and that's really the goal. You know, why
Interesting.
read about it if you can experience it?
Interesting.
I want to just say one word about that, which is in a way, so we demystified tarab and showed that it is really just another way of looking at what maqam is. That I sometimes look at the last 4 or 5 chapters of the book, and I'm like, these chapters are really saying the same thing, and are just a different way of looking at it. So I'm talking about maqam, modulation, sayr, improvisation, and tarab. These 5 ideas
Same thing.
are the same thing. Improvisation is just following the journey. Modulation is how you move. Sayr is the overall journey. Tarab is the result of following that journey. Tarab is the result of what you expect. What you expect is based on what you are used to. It's based on those cultural choices. So tarab is the result of cultural choices. Maqam is the result of cultural choices. Maqam takes the form that it takes because of the experience of tarab. Right? So all of these are just 5 different ways of looking at the same thing, which all basically comes down to listen to the music and you're going to absorb all of this. But for those who want to sort of understand it analytically or metaphorically, we can describe it in these ways. But the primacy for us is really that musical experience.
But even more, Sami, it's not just the modulation. You know, tarab expects the right intonation, and tarab expects the right ornamentation, and tarab expects the right instrumentation. You know, you have to understand all of these elements. That's why tarab is the last chapter. It's basically, it's the culmination, it's the result of putting together. You know, you have the right instruments that can do, you know, precision intonation, the right intonation, the right arrangement, the right ornamentation. If you don't ornament it, it'll be very boring. The right amount of improvisation, the right modulation, all the set, put them all together and you get tarab. So to explain tarab as a metaphysical phenomenon, you're actually ignoring all of these components that are laid out so clearly that you have to actually understand them. And once you put all those components together, it's like a dish, right? You know, you have to put the right spices, you have to put a bit of bay leaf, a bit of cinnamon, you have to put some tomato sauce, definitely garlic, and onion. Once you put all of these together and you cook it long enough, then you come out with the result. Like, you can't miss, you know, you don't have to read about it.
I'm hungry, man.
I'm hungry. I'm on a diet.
Guys, I'm really enjoying the discussion, and this is a very unique, good book. Congrats, and I'm expecting that you guys extend the book, or maybe have another kind of interesting project. But let's deep dive into some flavor of the book. Let me just pause with the new innovations of Ajnas. Can we elaborate more, Sami, on the innovated Ajnas?
Are you sure you have enough time? It's been 2 hours.
No, this is okay. As far as we are enjoying the discussion, our audience will enjoy.
All right. I'll do one, because I'm actually working on practicing for my next YouTube lesson.
Okay.
So Hijaz. We cataloged 2 variants. which have to do with moving outside of the basic scale. So the basic scale of Hijaz is these four notes. 1, 2, 3, 4. The note underneath the tonic, this is our tonic. The tonic is the note you rest on. Now, Hijaz car sounds like this. Which is different than, you hear a similar melody, but very different. So what's different is the note underneath the one. So if you only understand Hijaz as a 4-note tetrachord, these 4 notes, 2, 3, 4, and you don't understand that this note is part of Jins Hijaz. So when I play a melody in Jins Hijaz, I don't just use these 4 notes. I do this. 7, 1. So if those notes underneath the tonic are part of the Jins melody, then they're part of the Jins. That's our innovation. And the part 2 of that is that therefore this melody of Hijaz is different than this melody of Hijaz car. 6, 7. And the other innovation, I'm going to actually put these both in the same lesson.
We also argue that you can tell agents sometimes just by the leading tone and the tonic.
Yeah. So for example, with the jazz car, all I have to play is like to pick up what Johnny's saying is if I do, you already know it's Jins Hijaz car. It's Hijaz car immediately because of these intervals. Right, that's Hijaz car as opposed to. Now the other innovation that we have, again, none of our innovations are creating something new. All of our innovations are identifying something that already exists in the repertory and giving it a new name.
Yes.
Is, again, if you look, so this is the tonic of the jazz, 1, and we talked about what's different underneath the 1. Now, what about what's on top of the 4? 1, 2, 3, 4. Hijaz normally has this note as 5. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But there's a variant of Hijaz melody that does this. One, 2, 3, 4, 5. So this version of Hijaz that has a flat 5, we called Hijaz Murassa, which Johnny came up with that name because it's similar to the Nahawan Murassa, which is Nahawan with a lowered 5. But both these, so these two ajnas, and again, this will be in my next YouTube lesson, which when you're going to release this, maybe this will be out similar time. These two different versions of Hijaz would not look like different ajnas if you use the traditional theory. But if you use the theory the way that we talk about it, which is where we're thinking about melodic direction, we're thinking about notes outside of the basic area of the scale, right? Then you identify them. So let me just play the 3 in a row quickly, one by one, so you can hear that they're 3 different melodic entities. So this is Jins Hijaz and I'll just play like 15 seconds of Jins Hijaz. Okay. Now Jins Hijaz car. And then Hijaz Murassa. And Hijaz Murassa, you need to have some regular Hijaz, and then it comes in as a change. this that brings the Hijaz Marasa. You hear the change. Normal Hijaz. Hijaz Marasa. So that's,
Thanks.
yeah.
That makes it very clear, actually. And I don't know how much time do you have?
Well, we should probably go in a few minutes. I think we should wrap. It's long
Okay.
already. But I think you want to talk to us for another interview, I'm pretty sure.
For sure.
I need
Yeah.
a-
Johnny, we would like to take some rhythms if you would like to illustrate something from the book, please.
simple version of wahda is this. And you ornament it gradually more and more depending on the style required or the singer or depending on the circumstance. And then you take it down. So there's this constant
This is
calculation.
all the same rhythm the whole time.
It's all the same iqa wahda, but there's a very complex calculation. It's a bit sophisticated. That's why, like like in Western music, there's nothing to describe what's happening. Of course, nothing is notated. This is one of the things I love about my job as a riq player, as a dabit iqa. Nothing is notated. Even like the choice of iqa is not 100% prescribed. Sometimes we can judge. I need to modulate to مثلا, some different iqa or a few measures. I need to change it. Even within the same iqa choice, there's so many ways you can play it. You can play it simple. You can ornament it more. There can be an interplay between the different percussionists depending on what, like they role play. Somebody keeps it constant, somebody ornaments, vice versa. We can lift it up together, and I can single-handedly lift the mood of the song or of the performer, of the audience, just with this simple instrument. I'll give you an example. Like if we're going. Immediately, I'm raising the dynamics of the piece. Still iqa maqsoom, right? But I have so much freedom in how to interpret this iqa, how to ornament it, what choice of sounds to use, and how to actually work with the orchestra. Of course, I'm not playing this in a vacuum. I'm working with the band, and the band responds. There's this cycle of feedback between me and the band, me and the singer, and then between me and the audience. I feel like I have 3 remote controls, one for the audience, one for the singer, one for the band. And I'm sitting there like, basically like a puppet master, organizing everything and pulling them up and pulling them down and bringing them and speeding and slowing and making it louder and softer. And, all of this is coming from, and why does it work? Because they understand the language of this instrument. Because everybody's been trained, because they listen to Hassan Anwar, because they listen to Brahim al-Afifi, because they listen to Muhammad al-Arabi, because they listen to Adil Shamsuddin, because they know that this is the language, and everybody, there's this expectations. Nothing is notated. There's no training. There's no pre-training that we're going to do this. Once I play the jingles, you guys get more excited. No, it happens implicitly from the oral knowledge that, so obviously to write about all this, to write the chapter of the iqa, I didn't read any books about it. I don't have references because that's not how I learned. That's not how the next person is. Like when I give lessons on the riq, they're gonna learn it from me, and I learned it from other people, and we'll propagate it, orally. So again, I guess I'm making a case always for like not reading notation, but
Interesting.
this is why you can't notate this. You can't know. What are you gonna notate on the iqa? If you think notating the ornamentation on the violin is limiting, notating it on iqa is impossible. Impossible to do that. I'll have like handcuffs on my hands, So
Johnny, thank you very much actually for the example, and this is really interesting.
right.
And we will make a pause here, and maybe soon we'll meet again to have maybe an appreciation session that would reflect also some
Yeah, it'd be
content
lovely.
of the book together. Yeah. Actually, to conclude, I would really thank you, gentlemen, for this interesting session. But I would like to just ask you to highlight how are you reachable to the audience and the viewers.
Okay, I'm reachable on the Maqam World Contact Us page, and I regularly get readers' emails, and that's how people find me. So Maqam World Contact page, send me a note.
So I would say I'd love people to friend me on Facebook, Sami Abu Shumays, because I advertise. So I'm giving classes on Zoom through Brooklyn Maqam. So friend me on Facebook, and then you'll see my advertisements for classes. That's also where I post my new YouTube videos. I would say I'd encourage people to subscribe to me on YouTube. Again, the user is Abu Shumays, ABUSHUMAYS. I mean, if you just Google Maqam lessons on YouTube, you'll start to find me. And on Instagram, I think I'm also Abu Shumays on Instagram. Yeah, so I would say Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and you can find my email addresses from any of those sources.
Facebook too, but I'm not sophisticated enough to be on Instagram.
Instagram is fun, you know.
Anyway,
it's a different way to reach people.
I can barely cope with Facebook.
Yeah.
Thank you very much again, gentlemen.
Thank you very much for having us. It's really a great pleasure speaking with you, Fadl.